All right, welcome back to the John Miller Show here on Des Moines Sports Station, 1460 KXnO. In the studio with us, Iowa broadcasting legend Jim Zabel. Jim, how are you?
Fine, John.
Good.
Very interested in your show, as usual. An intriguing, interesting show. Sports shows should be.
Well, I appreciate that. I try my best, and I pay people like you to say those things when it's not intriguing and interesting. Danny Bishop's in the house. Well, he's doing some filming of Jim Zabel. We've got some new things we're doing, trying to. And now Jim Zabel's here. I got Jim's coming out of my ears.
That's right.
I couldn't be perfect since this will be on the web some point in time. So, Jim Zabel, your first ever webcam appearance. How do you feel about that?
Webcam appearance. Oh man, I go way back to Beat the Bear. I did Beat the Bear for 25 years, did Let's Go Bowling for 33 years, was on television nightly, the two news strips for 29 years, so I had a little bit of experience in this.
And you know where the camera is at all times. Ladies and gentlemen, he delivered that whole thing while turning over, looking right at that camera,
Keep
folks.
the camera on me at all times.
What was your okay,
I did a lot of interviews. I interviewed the celebrities coming to town. I was involved with interviews with 10 different presidents. I went to the Hoover Library to cover the opening of the Hoover Library for NBC.
West Branch, Iowa.
Herbert Hoover was there, right? And Dwight Eisenhower was there. Harry Truman was there. And you were there.
I wasn't there yet,
as a toddler. You weren't there as a toddler.
What year was that?
Oh, that was back around 1950, I think.
Yeah, I was born in 71. So
yeah.
I missed
I missed you by a couple of years.
Yeah. And,
of course, I interviewed President Kennedy a halftime of the hour Notre Dame game of 1958. Interviewed Ronald Reagan 18 different times. So, I take a lot of pride in interviewing presidents. And
absolutely.
I did a lot of political type shows and so forth, general interest talk shows in the afternoon. I put out 3 cookbooks. I did Let's Go Bowling, as I said, for 33 years.
3 cookbooks.
That's right. Jim Zabel's Pink Apron cookbooks. They sold in 50 states. And I'll tell you how that happened. When I started doing a talk show in 1966, it was May 2nd. I can remember the date. I'd called Jack Buck, my friend in St. Louis, because he was doing a general interest talk show. And he said, whatever you do, he said, don't get into recipes. Well, the first thing I did was get into recipes. And I finally wound up with 6,000 recipes, so I put out 3 different cookbooks. And, that was back in 1960s, 1970, 1971. And so Jack Buck said, you got the sports audience, but you want the woman's audience. So I figured recipes would be to get the woman's audience. And a woman, I figured, will drive through a blizzard to buy a cookbook. And that was true.
Well, they might. I don't know. Jim, this is going to be we did not prepare this question, so if it hits you sideways, you can laugh and say, let's go to the next question. Rich Eisen, you familiar with Rich Eisen? He's on ESPN. No, he's an
right.
NFL Network football analyst. Okay,
right.
He used to be on ESPN.
Right.
He's a married man. I guess a reporter from Philadelphia at a TV station recently this week unsolicited emailed him scantily clad pictures of herself to this guy, basically coming on to him. Did you ever have any interesting stories in your years as a broadcaster, like just let's say over adoring fans? And it doesn't have to be women and clad and scantily and things like that. I'm just saying
a lot of women, John, and you're going to find this out as you go along. And you go to cover a Rose Bowl or something like that, and people are they're partaking of beverages, and I've listened to you for a long time, Mr. Zabel, and my husband's right here, so he's given me permission to kiss you.
Beautiful.
And you wonder about it.
Yeah,
but now, John, when I go to the state fair, a young girl will come up to me and she said, Mr. Zabel, my grandmother loves you. That's what she'll say. My grandmother loves you.
What was the most challenging job you ever had to do as a broadcaster? Maybe the most heavy heart thing, or just the hardest thing? Doesn't have to be a heavy heart, but the hardest broadcast you ever had to do for whatever reason.
Well, I think to Chris Street, going through that experience with Chris Street, I flew back on the plane with him, and of course the following Monday he was killed in an auto accident in Iowa City, hit by a snow truck. And to go on the air, and was on WHO TV at that time, and have to go on and say my feelings about Chris Street were about the same as they were when I was editor-in-chief of the Daily Iowan and Niall Kinnick was killed, because they were both heroes. Of course, Kinnick will live on forever in our memories. Some people may not put Chris Street quite at that level, but at the time he was, because he was a big superstar, and all of a sudden he vanishes by being killed. That's a shock. That's hard to explain your emotions, and you have a tendency to break down, as people did, on the street. street when it was announced that Niall Kinnick was gone.
You know, some people don't realize this, but you have broadcast your fair share of Iowa State athletics.
I did. Some people said after Pete Taylor's demise, and Pete was a great friend of mine, who did the games before Pete Taylor? And, of course, I was one of them who did them, and my sidekick on basketball was Gary Thompson. Gary Thompson and I worked together for about 3 or 4 years, and Mac McCausland worked with me on basketball, and Sharm Sherman worked with me on basketball, Forrest Evashevsky on football. Evie's famous parting words were, Jim, I enjoyed working those 22 games with you. And I said, Evie, there were only 11. No, he said, the 11 you did and the 11 I saw. I made the games a little more exciting than they really were.
Talk about, I mean, you were involved in the sports scene back in that time. You were probably sports director for both WHO radio and television at the time. Dan Gable, when he was coming up through Iowa State and what he did in the Olympics, did that get a lot of attention?
It sure did, and he was an Iowa State guy and he was an Iowa guy. He's both. Dan Gable can straddle both sides of the street right now. He spoke at Marshalltown the other night. I introduced him, and he talked about Cale Sanderson as much as he talked about the Iowa program. So Dan Gable, you know, he came up through Iowa State, made his fame there, made his fame as a coach, greatest, most winning coach in any sport in the United States of America. Dan Gable, I think Phil Hattie told me one time, he went to Russia with him, and he said, people in Iowa may find this hard to believe because we just accept him. He's like the Rock of Gibraltar. He's just there. But Dan Gable walks down the street in Moscow, Russia, and 1,000 people will be following him because he's such a wrestling hero over there. And he is. I mean, the guy's just a giant of a personality. And to have Dan Gable among us is just amazing. I interviewed Bob Hope one time when he was right at the top of the heap in terms of a movie star, in terms of a performer on stage, in terms of everything. TV, he was the #1 rated guy. And I looked at him, you know, when I'm talking to him, and you can't really believe that you're talking to this guy. Just like when you talk to John F. Kennedy or talk to Ronald Reagan, you can't really believe you're talking to him, and they turn out to be, you know, pretty regular guys.
It happened to me the first year we did Sound Off together with you, but I've gotten used to you since then.
I love that Sound Off show. I just love it because you're a perfect person to work with, and between us, I think just based on what the reaction I get, John, when I go out to the Jasper County Eye Club or the Polk County Eye Club or the Marshall County Eye Club, people just love that show. They love the football, of course. They love the game, but win or lose, I think they love the post-game comments that people make, and that's part of it, is reacting to the game.
Those legendary pipes belong to Jim Zabel. You're listening to the John Miller Show on Des Moines Sports Station 1460 KXnO. Jim, I've got a couple more questions for you.
Okay.
I've got to read a couple of. I've got to let people know.
Got to make money. Go ahead.
Yeah, well, we've got to tell people about a couple of things we have coming up here as far as KXnO is concerned. The first being Hackfest. That's on May the 18th at Toad Valley. That's Frosty. Wendy's Frosty Floats are good from Wendy's, and 2 iCubs tickets. All right, and we just paid some bills. Jim, you paid a lot of bills in your day. One of my favorite Jim Zabel stories, and I want to get this one on the camera. Want to get this one on the camera for the webpage that you told me, Jim, when I interviewed you for the magazine, Hawkeye Nation magazine, a couple years ago when I wrote a story on you, was when you were basically advocating a bank and a savings account. And of course, WHO, border to border, coast to coast, the signal used to go even farther and wider, back in the day. And talk about a man that was so much believed in Jim Zabel that he invested in that savings account from a faraway location.
Well, that happened, John, when I was doing, Midwest Savings and Loan, I think it was a sponsor, and Jack Shelley and myself and Herb Plambeck, we were the personalities they wanted to advertise. And the only thing different about the commercial was, if you cannot go to Midwest Savings and Loan, send your money to me and I will personally deposit it. Well, I was doing basketball that time in the wintertime where our signal reaches far and wide throughout the hemisphere, and I got a check. I got checks as high as $15,000 made out to me personally. I got one for $6,000 from Ketchikan, Alaska, from a guy up there that said, I really appreciate it. I'm a big Hawkeye fan. I appreciate the broadcast so much that I've never been to Iowa, but I want to make my deposit in the bank. So we cut a commercial around that, a TV and a radio commercial around Ketchikan, Alaska. And years later, I asked Ron Halleck, who was the public relations director, I said, remember that commercial? He said, yeah. He said, that guy has never been to Iowa, and he's deposited $30,000 in the bank.
That's
you talk about believability and approval, and that's one of the trademarks and hallmarks. I'm so proud to be associated with WHO because it has had that kind of an aura to it that people believe in you.
What do you think of the state of WHO radio right now compared to back in the 50s?
You can't compare it really to the 1950s with a totally different time. We had 70 musicians and entertainers employed here when I was there. It's become more of a talk station, which I think it should be. I love it. I mean, I'm still here 63 years later, and I think it's the nature of the game has changed. Talk radio has changed everything. The nature of talk radio has changed. People are much more direct. I know when I first started doing Call Jim Zabel in 1962, it was revolutionary. We picked up a phone. Hello, this is Jim Zabel, and this is Frida down on the Skunk River calling you and telling you personally about her favorite recipe and so forth and so on. Now people get even more personal than that. Sometimes they get too personal for my listenership or give too many personal opinions. Yeah. It's too adversarial sometimes. But on the other hand, that's what people, ratings and revenue drive the whole thing.
What kind of recipe did Frida from the Skunk River give you?
She told about, she had 12 kids or something like that, how to make a potato soup for 12 kids. But I still get requests for my recipes for blue punch, particularly.
Blue punch? Well,
I can't give it right off the top of my head.
I'm afraid to ask even what's in blue punch. I mean,
blue coloring, and people love it for weddings, and they love it for graduation. Blue punch. One of the days, John, I'm going to get the recipe. I'm going to read it right on this show. I got to tell you what we got coming up on Sunday night.
Yeah, why don't you do that?
Can I do that?
Yeah, you go right ahead and do it.
All right.
Guys named Jim.
We're going to be talking about, the NBA playoffs, that amazing collapse, I guess I can say.
It really was.
The Dallas Mavericks last night, and the amazing victory by Don Nelson. I covered all of his games when he played at Iowa. Great coach, and we're going to be talking about that with NBA people on Sunday night on Two Guys Named Jim. We're also going to be talking, John, with a man that you're familiar with, Mark Silverman. He's head of the Big Ten Network. Everybody's wondering about this new network that's going to come on this summer and carry Iowa football. We'll be talking also with Gil Brandt of the NFL.com. He's the expert on what the draft meant and who's going where, and Randy and so forth, all the big changes that are being made in pro football. We'll be talking about all that and more with Jim Walden, Sunday night, 6 to 8.
That's Two Guys Named Jim. He's Jim Zabel. Always good to talk to you, Jim.
Good to talk to you, John.
See you down the road. Right. That's it for today's edition of the John Miller Show. I'm out of time. Corey Kuhn across the glass. Appreciate it. Jim Zabel. Marty and Miller up next, 4 to 7 p.m. Thanks for listening to Des Moines Sports Station 1460 KXnO. I'm on vacation next week. Adios. Stay out of the papers.